There is something about 1971 in California that people who lived through it cannot forget. The feeling that anything was possible. The sense that your mind belonged only to you. The moment when you could still disconnect, still disappear, still think a thought that no one else could track or record or monetize. And if you were alive and aware in California in the late 60s and early 70s, you know exactly what made that moment in history feel different from anything that came after. This was a time when human consciousness existed in a space that would soon vanish forever, when your thoughts were truly private, when your attention was yours to give, not something to be harvested, when you could spend an entire day without anyone knowing where you were or what you were doing, when the architecture of control that would define the next 50 years was just beginning to take shape, but hadn't yet closed around everyone, like a cage they couldn't see. This was the era when the last generation of truly free human minds walked the earth. Not free from government, or free from capitalism, or free from social pressure. Humans have never been free from those things, but free in a specific way that matters more than we realized at the time. Free from the surveillance systems, the algorithmic manipulation, the attention harvesting technologies, and the total digital enclosure that would soon make independent thought far more difficult than anyone in 1971 could have imagined. This was also the exact moment when the tools and systems and ideologies that would end that freedom were being invented. In California, by brilliant people who thought they were liberating humanity. The tragic irony is profound. The place and time that represented the peak of human cognitive freedom was also the place and time where that freedom was being dismantled, piece by piece, by people who believed they were building a better world. Let us walk through what actually happened in California in 1971 and the years immediately surrounding it. Let us understand why that specific place and time mattered. Let us step into that world and see how the cage was built. What did mental freedom actually mean in 1971? To understand what was lost, you have to understand what existed. Mental freedom in 1971 meant something very specific. It meant that large portions of your inner life were completely unknown to anyone else unless you chose to reveal them. Your reading habits were private. If you bought a book, you paid cash. Maybe a local bookstore owner recognized you, knew you liked science fiction or philosophy or radical politics. But there was no database, no record connecting your identity to every book you'd ever touched, no algorithm analyzing your reading patterns to predict your behavior or sell you products or flag you for surveillance. Your conversations were private. If you talked to a friend on the telephone, the phone company had a record that a call happened and how long it lasted, but they didn't record the content. They didn't analyze your word choices. They didn't build a psychological profile based on your tone of voice. They didn't use speech recognition to scan for keywords. And if you talked to someone in person, that conversation disappeared into the air the moment it ended. No recording, no transcript. Gone forever. Your location was private. If you left your house and went somewhere, nobody knew unless they physically saw you. There was no GPS tracker in your pocket broadcasting your coordinates every few seconds. No cell tower triangulation, no license plate readers, no surveillance cameras on every corner feeding into facial recognition systems. You could disappear into a city and simply vanish for hours or days. You could be alone with your thoughts. Your attention was yours. You decided what to think about and when. Yes, there was advertising. Yes, there was television. Yes, there were newspapers trying to capture your attention. But the scale and sophistication were nothing compared to what came later. You weren't carrying a device specifically engineered by teams of psychologists and neuroscientists to hijack your attention every waking moment. You weren't being targeted with personalized manipulation based on thousands of data points about your psychology. You could be bored. You could stare out a window for an hour and let your mind wander wherever it wanted to go. This was the texture of cognitive freedom in 1971, and it was about to end. California was the center of everything. Why California? Why 1971 specifically? Because that is where and when multiple threads came together in a way that would reshape human consciousness itself. California in the late 60s and early 70s was exploding with contradictory energies. The counterculture was at its peak. San Francisco had been the epicenter of the Summer of Love in 1967. Communes were forming up and down the coast. People were experimenting with psychedelics, with new forms of community, with rejection of conventional society. There was a widespread belief that consciousness itself was the frontier, that expanding and liberating the human mind was the most important work anyone could do. At the exact same time, Silicon Valley was being born. Not as the corporate empire it would become, but as a network of engineers, entrepreneurs, and visionaries who believed technology could transform society. Many of them were influenced by the counterculture. They'd taken LSD. They'd read the Whole Earth catalog. They believed in liberation and empowerment and giving individuals tools to think for themselves. The personal computer was being imagined, not yet built in any form regular people could use, but conceptualized. The idea that ordinary people could have access to computing power, that they could use these machines to amplify their intelligence, to connect with each other, to break free from centralized control, this idea was intoxicating, and it was emerging directly from California in this exact moment. Xerox PARC opened in Palo Alto in 1970. This research center would invent or refine almost everything that defines personal computing today. The graphical user interface, the mouse, Ethernet networking, object-oriented programming, laser printing, the vision of computers as tools for human creativity and communication was being actively built in labs in California in 1971. The ARPANET, the precursor to the Internet, was expanding. The first message had been sent in October 1969 between UCLA and Stanford. By 1971, 23 hosts. Computers were connected. The dream of a decentralized network that could route around damage, that could enable free communication without central control, was becoming real. The people building it believed they were creating tools for liberation. But something else was happening too. The seeds of surveillance, control, and cognitive manipulation were being planted at the exact same moment. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but inevitably, the architecture of control was being designed. In 1971, the technologies that would enable total surveillance didn't exist yet. But the intellectual frameworks and the early prototypes were emerging. Relational database theory was being formalized, the idea that you could store vast amounts of information in structured ways that allowed complex queries and connections. This was revolutionary for data management. Edgar Codd at IBM published his foundational paper on relational databases in 1970. This technology would eventually make it possible to connect every action, every transaction, every movement of millions or billions of people into searchable, analyzable systems. The microprocessor was invented in 1971. Intel released the 4004 chip in November of that year. For the first time, the core processing functions of a computer could be contained on a single integrated circuit. This made computers smaller, cheaper, and eventually ubiquitous. The microprocessor made it economically feasible to put computing power into everything, into phones, into cars, into cameras on every street corner, into devices people would carry with them everywhere. Computer networking was advancing rapidly. The logic of connecting machines to share information was being worked out, but what wasn't fully anticipated was how networks would evolve. The early vision was decentralized, lots of independent nodes communicating as peers. What actually emerged was increasingly centralized, massive platforms that everyone connects to, that mediate all interactions, that can monitor and control the flow of information. Behavioral psychology was being applied to system design. B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning, the idea that you could shape behavior through carefully designed rewards and punishments, was well established. The slot machine's variable reward schedule, the most addictive pattern ever discovered, was understood. These principles would eventually be baked into every app, every social media platform, every system designed to capture and hold human attention. But in 1971, those applications were still mostly theoretical. The advertising industry was getting more sophisticated. Demographic targeting was advancing. Psychological profiling was becoming more refined. Television advertising had become a science. The idea that you could study people, categorize them, and deliver specifically tailored messages to manipulate their behavior was well established. What would change was the scale and precision. Once digital systems could track everything about everyone, advertising would become micro-targeted manipulation at a level previously unimaginable. All of these threads, databases, microprocessors, networks, behavioral psychology, advertising, were separate in 1971. But they would weave together over the next decades into systems of control so pervasive that someone from 1971 would barely recognize human society. The last moment before the net closed. Here is what made 1971 special. The technologies that would enable surveillance and control existed in primitive forms, but they weren't yet deployed. They weren't yet connected. They weren't yet sophisticated enough, or cheap enough, or ubiquitous enough to actually close the net around human consciousness. You could still live most of your life outside any recordable, trackable system. Cash transactions left no digital trace. Letters you mailed were private unless someone physically intercepted them. Photographs existed as physical objects, not as metadata. Rich digital files automatically tagged with your identity, location, and timestamp. Phone calls from payphones were effectively anonymous. If you wanted to research something controversial, you went to a library, you pulled physical books off shelves. Maybe a librarian saw you, maybe not. But there was no permanent record linking your identity to your research interests. No list of everything you'd ever been curious about, stored forever in a database owned by a corporation or accessible to the government. If you wanted to organize politically, you met in person. You talked face-to-face. You distributed physical leaflets. Yes, governments infiltrated movements. Yes, there was surveillance of activists. The FBI's COINTELPRO program had been operating since 1956, targeting civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, and other political movements. But it required massive human resources. Agents had to physically follow people, install physical bugs, photograph meetings with actual cameras, file written reports. It was labor-intensive. It didn't scale. That was the key thing about surveillance and control. In 1971, it didn't scale. Watching people was expensive. It required human attention. You couldn't monitor everyone. You had to choose targets. And if you were just an ordinary person, not involved in anything governments considered threatening, you lived most of your life unobserved. That is what was about to change. The technologies being developed in California in 1971 would eventually make surveillance and control scale to everyone, everywhere, all the time. And it would happen so gradually, so seductively, with so many genuine benefits mixed in, that most people would welcome it. The counterculture carried the seeds of its own destruction. The tragic irony of California in 1971 is that the people who most valued freedom, who most wanted to liberate human consciousness, were the same people building the tools that would eventually constrain it. Stuart Brand published the Whole Earth Catalog from 1968 to 1972. It was a counterculture Bible, a guide to tools and ideas for people trying to build alternative societies. Brand's philosophy was about access to tools, about empowering individuals, about decentralization. He believed technology could serve liberation. He later became deeply involved with early computer culture, helping to bridge the counterculture and the emerging tech world. The Homebrew Computer Club started meeting in March 1975 in Menlo Park, California, just a few years after 1971, but directly descended from the same cultural moment. These were hobbyists, enthusiasts, many influenced by countercultural ideals, who believed personal computers would empower individuals against centralized institutions. Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs attended these meetings. The Apple computer emerged directly from the scene. The early vision was beautiful. Computers would be tools for creativity, for communication, for thinking. They would help people be more free, not less. The internet would be a decentralized network where everyone could publish, where information wanted to be free, where censorship would be impossible and authority would be undermined. What happened instead was that the tools of liberation became tools of control, not because anyone was lying, not because there was a conspiracy, but because the economic and political incentives shaped how the technologies evolved. Personal computers did empower individuals in many ways, but they also became surveillance devices, every keystroke potentially logged, every file potentially searched, every moment of usage potentially monitored. The internet did enable incredible communication and access to information, but it also centralized into a handful of massive platforms that mediate most human interaction online. Platforms that track everything, that build psychological profiles, that manipulate what you see to maximize engagement, that sell your attention to advertisers, that cooperate with government surveillance. The same databases that let you instantly search for information also let corporations and governments instantly search through everything about you. The same networks that let you connect with friends also let your behavior be analyzed and your thoughts be influenced. The same artificial intelligence that provides helpful recommendations also optimizes addiction and radicalizes vulnerable people. The people building these systems in California in the early 70s didn't intend this outcome. Most of them genuinely believed they were liberating humanity, but they were building inside a capitalist system that would inevitably bend their tools toward profit and control. What it felt like to be a free mind, to understand what was lost. Imagine what it felt like to think in 1971. You wake up in the morning, no phone buzzes with notifications, no algorithmic feed starts flooding your attention with content optimized to trigger emotional reactions. You lie in bed for a few minutes and your thoughts are your own. Whatever drifts through your mind, nobody knows. No data is being collected. No profile is being updated. You eat breakfast and read a physical newspaper. Yes, the newspaper has an editorial slant. Yes, someone chose what stories to cover, but you are not being micro-targeted. Everyone reading this newspaper sees the same content. The paper isn't subtly different for you based on a psychological profile. The stories aren't chosen by an algorithm that has discovered you engage more when you are made anxious or angry. You leave your house and go into the city. You walk down streets, you look in shop windows. You sit on a bench in a park and watch people. No one knows where you are. You are not carrying a tracking device. There are no cameras feeding your face into recognition systems. You are gloriously, completely anonymous. You could be anyone. You could be no one. You could sit here all day and disappear into your own thoughts, and no record would exist of this moment, except in your memory. You go to a bookstore and browse. You pick up books about radical politics, about altered states of consciousness, about controversial ideas. You buy 3 books with cash. The transaction is anonymous. No record connects your identity to these purchases. No algorithm notes your interest in these topics. No watch list is updated. These ideas are now private property inside your mind. You meet a friend at a cafe. You talk for 3 hours about everything, about society, about meaning, about your fears and hopes and strange thoughts. This conversation happens, and then it is gone. It exists only in your memories and your friends' memories. No transcript, no recording, no AI analyzing your sentiment or your word choices. The conversation was real and private and temporary and human. This is what it meant to be a free mind in 1971, not free from influence. Humans are always influenced by culture, by media, by other people. But free from total surveillance, free from algorithmic manipulation, free from systems specifically designed to predict and control your behavior, free in a way that is almost unimaginable. Now, the cage closed slowly, then all at once. The tragedy is that we didn't lose this freedom in a single moment. We gave it away gradually, one convenience at a time, one innovation at a time, one small trade-off at a time. The personal computer arrived in the late 70s, useful, empowering. You could write, create, calculate, play, worth having, and eventually worth connecting to networks. The internet became accessible to regular people in the 90s, revolutionary. The world's information at your fingertips. communication across distances, communities forming around shared interests. Of course you wanted to be online. Of course you gave accurate information when you signed up for services. How else would it work? The mobile phone became ubiquitous in the 2000s, incredibly convenient. You could be reached anywhere, you could reach anyone. You could have a camera and a music player and GPS and the entire internet in your pocket, worth carrying everywhere. And yes, that meant your location was always tracked, but think of the benefits. Think of the maps. Think of being able to look up anything, anytime. Worth it, right? Social media exploded in the late 2000s, connection, sharing, seeing what friends were doing, publishing your thoughts, building an audience. It felt empowering. You were creating content, you were expressing yourself. Sure, the platforms were collecting data, but you weren't paying money. So that seemed fair. You didn't fully understand yet that you weren't the customer. You were the product. Your attention was being harvested and sold. Your behavior was being analyzed and shaped. Each step seemed reasonable. Each technology brought genuine benefits. Each trade-off seemed worth it. But the cumulative effect was total. By 2020, the cage was fully built. Nearly everyone in developed countries carried a surveillance device everywhere. Nearly all communication flowed through platforms that monitored and shaped it. Nearly all information access was mediated by algorithms optimized for engagement, not truth. Nearly all transactions created digital records. Nearly everyone's entire life history, every search, every purchase, every message, every movement, existed in databases owned by corporations and accessible to governments. A person from 1971 transported to 2025 would be horrified, not by the technology itself, but by how completely humans had submitted to being monitored, analyzed, predicted, and manipulated every waking moment, what we lost that we can never get back. The freedom that existed in 1971 is gone, not diminished, not reduced. Gone. The infrastructure of modern life makes the kind of privacy and cognitive autonomy that people took for granted in 1970. One essentially impossible now. You cannot live a normal life in developed countries without carrying a tracking device. Try functioning without a smartphone. Try getting most jobs. Try participating in modern commerce and communication. You can do it, technically, but you become a strange outsider, cut off from systems everyone else depends on. You cannot communicate without your communications being logged. Every email, every text, every call creates records. Even encrypted communications leave metadata. Who contacted whom, when, for how long. And most people don't bother with encryption anyway. You cannot access information without creating records of your interests. Every search query, every article read, every video watched gets recorded. Your curiosity itself is no longer private. Your thoughts revealed through what you seek to learn about are data to be analyzed. You cannot escape algorithmic manipulation. The content you see is chosen by systems optimized to keep you engaged. Your emotional responses are data points used to refine the manipulation. You are in a personalized reality tunnel shaped by algorithms you don't control and can't inspect, optimized for metrics you didn't choose. The architecture of control is now baked into the infrastructure of daily life. You cannot opt out without opting out of modern society entirely, and even then you are still captured by surveillance cameras, license plate readers, data brokers buying and selling information about you. This is what we traded for convenience. This is what we lost. The people in California in 1971 were the last generation to know what it felt like to have a mind that was truly private, truly yours, truly free from systematic surveillance and manipulation, why it matters more than we think. Some people dismiss these concerns. They say if you are not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide. They say the conveniences are worth it. They say we're safer now. They say surveillance and data collection are just part of modern life, but that misses something fundamental about human consciousness and freedom. When you know you are being watched, you change. When you know everything you do is being recorded, you become more conformist, more careful, less willing to explore dangerous or controversial ideas. The freedom to think without observation is essential for genuine intellectual freedom. When your information environment is shaped by algorithms you don't control, your ability to form independent judgments is compromised. You are not seeing reality, you are seeing a personalized simulation optimized to keep you engaged, which usually means making you more emotional, more polarized, more certain, more tribal. When your attention is constantly hijacked by systems specifically engineered to be addictive, your ability to think deeply, to reflect, to develop your own ideas is damaged. Constant distraction is not a neutral condition. It changes what kinds of thoughts you can think. The cognitive freedom that people in 1971 took for granted was a historical anomaly. For most of human history, people lived in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy was limited, but there were also limits to scale and memory. Gossip was local and temporary. Records were sparse. Power was constrained by the limitations of technology. The mid-20th century, especially the 1950s through the 70s, represented a sweet spot. Mass society and urbanization created anonymity. You could be a stranger. Technology wasn't yet sophisticated enough for comprehensive surveillance. You could live a significant portion of your life unobserved, unknowable, free. That window is closed. The technologies developed in California, starting around 1971, have created a new kind of society, one where privacy is nearly impossible, where anonymity is rare, where every action creates data, where your thoughts and attention and behavior are constantly monitored and shaped by systems optimized for control and profit. The last free minds knew something we've forgotten. The people who lived through California in the late 60s and early 70s, who felt what it was like to have a genuinely free mind before the cage closed, understood something we've forgotten. They understood that consciousness is fragile, that your ability to think for yourself requires protection from manipulation, that systems of power will always try to control how people think, that technology is not neutral. It embodies values and serves interests. Many of them tried to warn us. They tried to build alternatives. They tried to keep the liberatory potential of technology alive while resisting its control applications. Some of them are still trying, but the economic and political incentives were too strong. The convenience was too seductive. The control crept in so gradually that each step seemed acceptable. And now we live in the world they feared. Every Christmas, people who remember the holidays of 50 years ago feel a bittersweet ache for what is lost, the simplicity, the magic, the way things felt bigger because they were rarer and more focused. People who remember what it felt like to have a free mind in 1971 feel something similar. Not just nostalgia, but grief for a kind of human experience that has been lost. The ability to be truly alone with your thoughts, to be unknown, to explore ideas without surveillance, to have your attention be your own. We can't go back. The technologies exist. The systems are built. The cage is closed. But we can remember. We can understand what was lost. We can recognize that the total surveillance and algorithmic manipulation we now accept as normal is not inevitable, not natural, not how things have to be. The last free human minds walked the earth in California in 1971. They were building the tools they believed would liberate everyone. Instead, those tools became instruments of control more total than any previous generation could have imagined. That is the tragedy. That is the lesson. That is what we must never forget. Human consciousness is more fragile than we think. Freedom requires not just political rights, but also the technological and social conditions that make independent thought possible. Once those conditions are lost, getting them back is almost impossible. The people of 1971 didn't know they were living through the last moment of a particular kind of freedom. They thought the future would be more free, not less. They built tools for liberation that became chains. That is the warning they left us. That is the memory we must carry forward. That is why 1971 in California matters more than almost anyone realizes. The last free minds are gone now. Their world is gone. But the memory of what they knew, what they felt, what they tried to protect, that memory is precious. It reminds us that the world we live in now where privacy is dead and attention is harvested, and thoughts are tracked, and behavior is manipulated. This is not inevitable, this is not natural, this is not how it has to be. We chose this. One small convenience at a time. We can choose differently. But first, we have to remember what we lost. We have to understand that the freedom that seemed so ordinary in 1971 was actually extraordinary, and it is gone.